After Ellie Gibson discovered that her real name was Sarah Wells and that the people she had called her parents for over 15 years were actually her kidnappers, her world shattered. Realizing she had been living a lie her entire life, she struggled to come to terms with the truth. But through it all, her real parents supported her however they could, and over time, Sarah managed to bond with them, finally making up for the lost years. However, she would soon learn that her past life and the people who took her weren't ready to let her go so easily, and that her journey to a normal life was far from over. Before we dive into part 2 of this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. The evening shadows lengthened across the bustling streets of London as Ellie, now known as Sarah Wells, emerged from the police interview room. The past few hours had been a whirlwind of statements and evidence gathering, each moment feeling like an eternity as she recounted the shocking revelations of her true identity. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders as she made her way to the waiting area. Her eyes, red-rimmed from hours of tears and stress, scanned the room until they landed on two familiar yet strange faces. Her real parents, Nessa and Edric Wells. A lump formed in Sarah's throat as she approached them. The air between them crackled with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Together, I mean." Nessa and Edric exchanged a quick glance before nodding in unison. "Of course, sweetheart," Nessa replied, her voice warm and comforting despite the tension evident in her posture. They were led to a small private room within the station. The stark fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across their faces, emphasizing the lines of worry and years of heartache etched into Nessa and Edric's features. As the door closed behind them, sealing them in a bubble of privacy, the weight of 15 years of separation seemed to descend upon the room. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence, each unsure of how to bridge the chasm of lost time between them. Nessa was the first to break the silence. "Sarah," she began, her voice quavering with emotion, "we've missed you so much. Every single day since you were taken from us, we've searched for you." Edric nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Even when the police told us it seemed hopeless, we never gave up hope. We knew you were out there somewhere." Sarah listened, her heart aching at the pain evident in their voices. She could see the toll the years of searching had taken on them, the premature lines around their eyes, the grey streaking their hair. "We were haunted by guilt and heartbreak," Nessa continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Not knowing if you were safe, if you were happy, it was torture." Edric reached out, gently placing his hand over Nessa's. "Learning now that you had a good life, that you were cared for, it gives us some peace at least." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. The love and devotion of these strangers, her true parents, was overwhelming. I want to get to know you better," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to learn who you are, to get closer to you and build a relationship." A spark of hope ignited in Nessa and Edric's eyes at her words. Sarah continued, gaining confidence as she spoke. "I'm so grateful that you never gave up searching. Without that missing person poster, I would have never found out about all this." Taking a deep breath, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life. "I want to stop living this life of lies," she declared. "I want to get my real name back, Sarah Wells. You can call me Sarah from now on. I'm your daughter, not the daughter of the kidnappers." Nessa and Edric exchanged a look of pure joy, tears now flowing freely down their cheeks. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she continued, "I'd like to accept your offer of staying with you in London. I don't want to go back to the USA where the lies of my past will haunt me. I want to build a new life here, get a job, and live with you." The Wells parents' faces lit up with happiness. "Of course, Sarah," Edric said, his voice choked with emotion. "Our home is your home. It always has been." Unable to contain their emotions any longer, they stood and embraced Sarah in a group hug. The warmth of their arms around her felt right, as if she had finally found a piece of herself that had been missing all these years. As they broke apart, wiping away tears and sharing watery smiles, Sarah felt a sense of purpose settling over her. "I need to get real UK passports," she said, her voice stronger now, "and other documents. I want to make this official." They exited the room together, a united front facing the world. Sarah approached one of the officers, explaining her desire for new, legitimate documents. The officer nodded understandingly, assuring her that they could arrange it given she was born in England. "It will take a few days," he explained, "but we can send it to your address once it's ready." Sarah turned to Nessa, suddenly realizing she didn't know where home was. "Mom," she said, the word feeling strange yet right on her tongue, "what's our address?" "So they can send the passport and other documents there." As Nessa provided the details to the officer, Sarah felt a sense of surrealism wash over her. Just this morning, she had been Ellie Gibson, an American teenager on vacation. Now she was Sarah Wells, reclaiming her British identity and preparing to start a new life in London. The enormity of the change threatened to overwhelm her, but as she looked at the loving faces of Nessa and Edric, her real parents, she felt a surge of strength. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. She had found her true family, and with them, she would forge a new path forward, free from the lies that had defined her past. As Sarah, Nessa, and Edric prepared to leave the police station, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. The world outside seemed both familiar and strange, as if Sarah were seeing it through new eyes. Just as they were about to step out into the London evening, an officer approached them, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "Miss Wells," he said, addressing Sarah with her newly reclaimed name, "the Gibsons would like to speak with you again before they're processed. They'll likely be held until their court date, so if you want a last opportunity to talk, it would be now." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. The mention of the Gibsons, the people she had called Mom and Dad for 18 years, sent a confusing mix of emotions coursing through her. Anger, love, betrayal, and a lingering sense of loyalty all warred within her. She hesitated, her gaze flicking between Nessa and Edric, who watched her with concern and barely concealed apprehension. After a moment of internal struggle, Sarah nodded. "I'll speak to them," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "but only with Lisa. I don't feel safe talking to Henry." Almost unconsciously, her hand rose to her split lip, the injury a stark reminder of Henry's violent outburst earlier. The memory of his anger, so at odds with the loving father she had known, sent a shiver down her spine. Turning to Nessa and Edric, Sarah offered a weak smile. "I have to do this," she explained, seeing the worry in their eyes. "I need closure, I guess." They nodded understanding, though Sarah could see the pain it caused them. This was yet another reminder of the years they had lost, of the bond Sarah shared with her kidnappers that they could never fully understand. The officer led Sarah to an interview room, explaining that they would be left alone but assuring her that help was just a button press away if needed. Moments later, another officer entered with Lisa Gibson, her hands cuffed in front of her. As the officers left, closing the door behind them, Sarah found herself face to face with the woman she had called mother for 15 years. Lisa looked small and defeated, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Ellie," Lisa began, her voice cracking with emotion. "Sarah," Sarah corrected gently but firmly. "My name is Sarah Wells now." Lisa nodded, accepting the correction, though Sarah could see the flash of pain in her eyes. "Sarah," she repeated, as if testing the name. "I'm so sorry for all of this. I want to tell you the whole truth. I don't want to continue lying to you." Sarah leaned back in her chair, bracing herself for what was to come. Despite everything, a part of her still yearned for Lisa's comfort, for the familiar love she had known all her life. But she steeled herself, reminding herself of the magnitude of Lisa and Henry's betrayal. Lisa took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "We were living in the USA when Henry and I were expecting our first child," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We had been trying for 4 years, and when it finally worked, we were so happy. But then on the day of birth..." Sarah listened intently as Lisa recounted the tragic tale of their biological child's death, the devastation it had wrought on their lives, particularly on Henry's mental state. She spoke of their failed attempts to adopt, thwarted by Henry's PTSD and anger issues. "That's when we came to London on vacation," Lisa continued, her voice hollow with the weight of her confession. "We needed time to process everything. That's when we first saw you in the park." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as Lisa described how Henry had become fixated on her, convincing himself and Lisa that Sarah's real parents didn't care for her properly. "Henry started visiting the park more often," Lisa explained, her eyes distant as she recalled those fateful days. "He noticed that every time we saw you there, your parents were always busy on their laptops or phones. They never played with you or paid attention to you. You were always playing alone while they were consumed by their work." Lisa's voice trembled as she continued, "Henry convinced himself, and then me, that you would have a better life with us. He said your parents didn't really care for you, that they were too wrapped up in their own world to give you the love and attention you deserved. He managed to convince me," Lisa admitted, shame evident in her voice. "That's when we took you and fled to the USA with fake documents." As Lisa's story unfolded, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of her heart ached for the pain Lisa and Henry had endured, the desperation that had driven them to such extremes. But another part recoiled at the selfishness of their actions, the lives they had destroyed in pursuit of their own happiness. "Henry isn't always how you think he is," Lisa warned, her voice taking on an urgent tone. "When we argued, he often became violent. It became less frequent after we had you. You somehow filled his emptiness, but as you saw earlier—" Sarah nodded, her hand unconsciously touching her bruised lip again. "I always knew he was in the military, but I never realized he was struggling with this. Maybe we should try to get him help," she suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. Lisa shook her head vehemently. "I've tried for years, but he's become too damaged. Sarah, I need you to understand. You need to stay away from him. He's capable of much more sinister things." The warning sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She listened as Lisa explained her fears about the potential outcomes of their case, the possibility of probation rather than jail time. "If Henry tries to contact you again, stay away," Lisa pleaded. "I fear he might be too hurt now, and who knows what he might do for revenge." As their time drew to a close, Sarah found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. "I still love him," she admitted, her voice small. "He was my father for all these years. I never knew about his struggles. I don't know what to think now." Lisa reached out, stopping just short of touching Sarah's hand. "I understand," she said softly. "But please, be careful. There are some things you won't understand, but you have to trust me on this." As Sarah prepared to leave, she turned back to Lisa. "We'll stay in contact through phone," she promised. "I need time to come to terms with my own emotions, to figure out what I want to do next. But thank you for telling me the truth, finally." With those words, Sarah left the room, her mind whirling with new information and warnings. As she watched an officer lead Lisa away in handcuffs, she felt as if she were watching the final chapter of her old life close. The future stretched before her, uncertain and frightening, but also filled with the possibility of truth and genuine love. The cool evening air hit Sarah's face as she stepped out of the police station with Nessa and Edric. The familiar London streets now held a new significance. This was her birthplace, the city where her life should have unfolded. The weight of that realization settled heavily on her shoulders as they walked towards the Wells car. Nessa and Edric exchanged concerned glances, clearly sensing the tension radiating from Sarah. "Was the conversation with Lisa okay?" Nessa asked hesitantly, stumbling over how to refer to the woman who had raised her daughter. Sarah sighed deeply, running a hand through her hair. "I'm just feeling very mixed emotions right now," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. As they reached the car, a sleek silver sedan that spoke of comfortable middle-class living, Edric unlocked the doors. "We understand, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle. "This is a lot to process. We're here if you want to talk about it." Sarah nodded gratefully as she slid into the back seat. As Nessa settled into the passenger seat and Edric took the wheel, an awkward silence fell over the car. The air felt thick with unasked questions and unspoken fears. As they pulled away from the curb, Nessa turned in her seat to face Sarah. "We're so happy you're coming home with us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We've dreamed of this moment for so long. We hope we can make up for the time we lost." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat at the raw emotion in Nessa's voice. "I hope so too," she managed to say, offering a small smile. Eager to break the tension, Edric spoke up from the driver's seat. "So, Sarah," he began, his tone deliberately light, "tell us about yourself. What are your interests? What kind of music do you like?" Grateful for the shift to safer topics, Sarah began to share details about her life. She told them about her love for photography, her favorite bands, her dreams of studying journalism in college. As she spoke, she could see Nessa and Edric drinking in every word, as if trying to make up for 15 years of missed conversations in a single car ride. In turn, they shared snippets of their own lives. Nessa was a primary school teacher, while Edric worked as an architect. They lived in a cozy house in a quiet London suburb, with a small garden that Nessa loved to tend. As they drove through the London streets, Sarah found herself studying the city with new eyes. The iconic landmarks she had admired as a tourist just days ago now held a different meaning. This was her heritage, her birthright. The realization was both exhilarating and overwhelming. "We kept your room," Nessa said suddenly, breaking a momentary lull in the conversation. "All these years we kept it ready for you. We never lost hope that you'd come back to us someday." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes at this revelation. The depth of their love and devotion, maintained through years of heartache and uncertainty, was almost too much to comprehend. As they turned onto a quiet residential street, Edric slowed the car. "We're almost home," he announced, a note of excitement in his voice. Sarah peered out the window, taking in the rows of neat houses with their small front gardens. It was a far cry from the bustling American suburb where she had grown up, but there was something comforting about its quaint charm. As they pulled into a driveway, Sarah felt her heart begin to race. This was it, her true home, the place where her life should have unfolded. As she stepped out of the car, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. Nessa and Edric flanked her as they walked up the short path to the front door. "Welcome home, Sarah," Nessa said softly as Edric unlocked the door. The door swung open, revealing a warm, lived-in home filled with photos and mementos of a life Sarah had never known. As she stepped over the threshold, Sarah felt as if she were stepping into a new chapter of her life, one filled with truth, love, and the promise of a future free from lies. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains of Sarah's new room, gently rousing her from sleep. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. It had now been 21 days since that fateful day at the police station, 21 days of adjusting to her new reality as Sarah Wells. The initial shock had gradually given way to a strange new normal, filled with tentative steps towards building relationships with Nessa and Edric, her real parents. Sarah sat up in bed, running a hand through her tousled hair as she glanced around the room. It was a curious mix of the old and the new. The furniture and decor chosen by Nessa and Edric years ago, now interspersed with Sarah's own belongings. The house was quiet as Sarah made her way downstairs, the wooden steps creaking softly under her feet. As she entered the kitchen, she was greeted by the sight of Nessa and Edric already up and about, a spread of breakfast foods laid out on the table. "Good morning, sweetheart," Nessa said warmly, her face lighting up at the sight of Sarah. "Did you sleep well?" Sarah nodded, offering a small smile as she took a seat at the table. "Yes, thank you," she replied, reaching for a piece of toast. The domesticity of the scene, so normal yet so new to her, still felt surreal at times. As they ate, Sarah noticed Nessa eyeing a pile of envelopes on the counter. Following her gaze, Sarah felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. "More letters from him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nessa nodded, her expression a mixture of concern and sympathy. "I'm afraid so, dear," she confirmed. "They arrived this morning." Sarah sighed heavily, pushing her half-eaten breakfast away. Since her arrival in her new home, she had received countless letters from Henry, sent from the prison where he awaited trial. The first few she had opened, only to find a confusing mix of angry accusations and desperate apologies. After that, she had stopped reading them, the emotional toll too great to bear. "I can't keep doing this," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "Every time I see one of those envelopes, it just reminds me of everything, of all the lies." Edric reached across the table, gently squeezing Sarah's hand. "You don't have to read them if you don't want to," he assured her. "We can send them back, or we can keep them somewhere out of sight until you're ready to deal with them." Sarah nodded gratefully, feeling a rush of affection for these people who had so quickly become her support system. Their patience and understanding had been unwavering, even as she navigated the complex emotions tied to her past. As they finished breakfast, Sarah glanced at the clock and realized with a start that they needed to leave soon. Today was the day she would return to the United States to collect the last of her belongings from her old home. The thought filled her with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "We should get ready," she said, standing up from the table. "We don't want to miss our flight." Nessa nodded, quickly clearing the dishes. "I'll come with you," she reminded Sarah, "for support." As Sarah headed upstairs to get her suitcase, she paused in front of the mirror in the hallway. The face that looked back at her was familiar, yet somehow different. The past 3 weeks had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She packed quickly, throwing a few necessities into a small suitcase. This trip was only for a day, a quick in and out to collect the items she couldn't bear to leave behind. As she zipped up the suitcase, her hand brushed against her new UK passport, the one bearing her true name, Sarah Wells. A small thrill went through her at the sight of it, a tangible symbol of her reclaimed identity. Downstairs, Nessa was waiting by the door, her own small bag packed and ready. Edric stood beside her. "The taxi should be here any minute," he said, checking his watch. As if on cue, the sound of a car horn drifted through the open window. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the journey ahead. This trip back to her old life felt like closing a chapter, one final step in embracing her new reality. With a final wave to Edric, Sarah and Nessa climbed into the taxi. As it pulled away from the curb, Sarah felt as if she were truly embarking on the next chapter of her life, one filled with truth, love, and the promise of a future free from the shadows of her past. The transatlantic flight seemed to stretch on endlessly, each hour marked by the soft hum of the engines and the occasional ding of the seatbelt sign. Sarah spent most of the journey lost in thought, her mind racing with memories and apprehensions about what lay ahead. Beside her, Nessa dozed fitfully, her presence a comforting anchor in the sea of uncertainty. As the plane touched down in Ohio, Sarah felt a jolt of familiarity. This had been her home for as long as she could remember, yet now it felt alien, like a movie set of a life she had once known. They made their way through customs and baggage claim in a daze, the jet lag and emotional weight of their journey leaving them both exhausted. Outside the airport, they hailed an Uber. As they settled into the back seat, Sarah gave the driver the address, her old address. The words felt strange on her tongue, as if she were speaking a language she had long forgotten. The drive through the familiar streets of her childhood was surreal. Sarah found herself pointing out landmarks to Nessa, her old school, the park where she used to play, the ice cream shop where she had celebrated countless birthdays. With each memory shared, Sarah felt a curious mix of nostalgia and detachment, as if she were narrating someone else's life. As they turned onto her old street, Sarah felt her heart begin to race. The sight of her childhood home, a modest 2-story house with a well-tended garden, brought a flood of emotions she wasn't prepared for. Memories of family dinners, holiday celebrations, and quiet evenings spent reading in her room all came rushing back. The Uber came to a stop, and for a moment Sarah couldn't bring herself to move. Nessa reached over, gently squeezing her hand. "Take your time, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're in no rush." Drawing strength from Nessa's support, Sarah took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. As she did, something caught her eye. A van parked at the other end of the street. It wasn't a vehicle she recognized, and its presence sent a small shiver of unease down her spine. "Mum," she said, the word still feeling new on her tongue when directed at Nessa. "Do you see that van? Do you think it could be the police? Maybe they're still investigating." Nessa frowned, studying the vehicle. "I'm not sure, dear, but maybe you're right. It could be an undercover investigator." Sarah shook her head, trying to dismiss her paranoia. "We're probably just being overly cautious," she said, forcing a smile. "Let's go inside." As they approached the front door, Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she inserted the key. The lock turned with a familiar click, and the door swung open, revealing the interior of her childhood home. The house was exactly as she remembered it, yet somehow different. The familiar scents, the arrangement of furniture, the family photos on the walls. All of it felt like a carefully constructed set, a facsimile of the life she had once believed was hers. Sarah led Nessa through the house, showing her the living room, the kitchen, and finally her bedroom. As they stood in the doorway of her room, Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. This space, once her sanctuary, now felt like a museum exhibit of a life that no longer belonged to her. "You had a beautiful home," Nessa said gently, her eyes taking in every detail. "I'm glad to see that they took good care of you." Sarah nodded, unable to speak around the emotions clogging her throat. She moved to her closet, beginning the task of sorting through her belongings. Each item she touched brought a fresh wave of memories, some happy, some now tainted by the knowledge of the lies that had surrounded her. As Sarah worked, carefully selecting the items she wanted to keep, Nessa watched from the doorway. The older woman's face was a mask of conflicting emotions: sadness for the years lost, gratitude that her daughter had been loved, and a fierce protectiveness for the young woman before her. After a while, Nessa spoke up. "I'll wait in the car, sweetheart," she said softly. "I don't want to intrude on this moment. Take all the time you need to say goodbye." Sarah looked up, surprised by the offer. "Are you sure?" she asked, touched by Nessa's sensitivity. Nessa nodded, a sad smile on her face. "This is your past, Sarah. You need to face it on your own terms. I'll be right outside if you need me." As Nessa left, Sarah felt a curious mix of relief and apprehension. She was grateful for the privacy to process her emotions, but the thought of being alone in this house of memories was daunting. Turning back to her task, Sarah continued to sort through her belongings. She was selective, choosing only the items that held true sentimental value. Photo albums, a few cherished books, the stuffed animal she'd had since childhood. Everything else, she decided, could be left behind. This was about closing a chapter, not trying to transport her entire past into her new life. As she worked, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The house seemed to creak and settle around her, each sound making her jump. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, a result of the stress and emotion of the day, but the feeling persisted. Finally, with her suitcase packed and her room looking strangely bare, Sarah took one last look around. This room, this house, had been her whole world for 15 years. Now it felt like a stage set, ready to be struck and packed away. With a deep breath, Sarah turned to leave, ready to close this chapter of her life and embrace the future that awaited her in London. But as she reached for the doorknob, a sound from downstairs made her freeze, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard under someone's foot. Sarah's heart began to race. Nessa was waiting in the car, and she was supposed to be alone in the house. As fear gripped her, Sarah realized that her instincts about the van might have been right after all. Someone was in the house with her, and she had a sinking feeling that her past wasn't quite ready to let her go. Her mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a police officer doing a final sweep of the house? Or perhaps a neighbor who had seen activity and come to investigate? But deep down, a nagging fear told her it was something else entirely. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Sarah called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Hello? Is someone there? Mom, is it you?" For a moment there was no response. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, began ascending the stairs. Sarah's fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and she quickly scanned her room for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes landed on a heavy trophy from a high school photography competition. She grabbed it, holding it tightly as she faced the door. The footsteps grew louder, and then a figure appeared in the doorway. Sarah's grip on the trophy loosened as shock washed over her. Standing before her was not a stranger or a police officer, but a face she recognized from family gatherings and holiday photos. Her uncle, Henry's brother. "Uncle Jack?" Sarah gasped, confusion and fear warring in her voice. "What are you doing here?" Jack's face, so similar to Henry's that it made Sarah's heart ache, was a mask of forced calm. "Ellie," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Or should I say Sarah? We need to talk." Sarah took a step back, her guard still up despite the familiar face. "How did you get in here?" she demanded, her voice stronger now. Jack held up a key, a sad smile on his face. "Your father, Henry, he always kept a spare key with me, for emergencies." The mention of Henry sent a jolt through Sarah. "What do you want?" she asked warily. Jack's expression softened slightly, but there was an underlying tension that Sarah couldn't ignore. "I'd like to invite you to my home," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "We need to talk about all this. I don't think Henry is the bad person you've been led to believe he is." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine at his words. "I've already made my decision," she said firmly. "I'm moving to the UK. Once I'm ready to talk to Henry, I'll reach out to him myself." A flash of something, anger, frustration, crossed Jack's face before he schooled his features back into a mask of concern. "This wasn't a question, Sarah," he said, his voice hardening. "You should come with me now. We need to sort this out." Sarah's heart began to race again as she realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a friendly visit. It was an attempt to manipulate her, possibly even to take her back to Henry. "You're being ungrateful," Jack continued, his voice rising slightly. "Henry gave you everything over the years. How can you turn your back on him now?" Sarah felt a surge of anger at his words. "He kidnapped me," she shot back, her voice trembling with emotion. "He stole me from my real parents, lied to me my entire life, and then became violent when I found out the truth. How dare you call me ungrateful?" Just as Jack opened his mouth to respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Sarah's head whipped around to see Nessa, her face a mixture of concern and determination. Relief flooded through Sarah at the sight of her mother. Jack's demeanor changed instantly, shock evident on his face at the unexpected arrival. He quickly tried to compose himself, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes as he assessed the new situation. "Come, Sarah," Nessa said firmly, her eyes never leaving Jack. Without hesitation, Sarah moved to Nessa's side, feeling safer with her mother's presence. They retreated into the bedroom, quickly locking the door behind them. "Who is that man?" Nessa whispered urgently as Sarah gathered her belongings. "Henry's brother," Sarah explained in a hushed tone. "He wants me to go with him to talk about Henry." Nessa's face hardened with resolve. "We need to call the police," she said, reaching for her phone. As Nessa dialed 911, they could hear Jack's voice through the door, his tone shifting between pleading and threatening. "Sarah, please," he called. "Your father Henry only wants what's best for you. Open the door or I'll have to come in forcefully." Sarah's hands shook as she clutched her suitcase, fear and adrenaline coursing through her veins. She listened as Nessa quickly explained the situation to the 911 dispatcher, giving their address and describing the threat. Just as Nessa ended the call, they heard the welcome sound of police sirens in the distance. "The police are on their way," Sarah called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "You should go now." There was a moment of tense silence, and then they heard Jack's footsteps retreating down the stairs. From the bedroom window, they watched as he hurried to his car, driving away just moments before the police car turned onto the street. As the sound of the police siren grew louder, Sarah felt the adrenaline drain from her body, leaving her feeling weak and shaky. Nessa wrapped her in a tight embrace, and Sarah clung to her, grateful for the comfort and protection of her real mother. "It's over now," Nessa murmured soothingly, stroking Sarah's hair. "You're safe. We're going home." As they heard the police car pull up outside, Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. This encounter had been a stark reminder that her past wasn't ready to let her go just yet. But with Nessa by her side, she felt stronger, more prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sound of knocking came from downstairs. The police had arrived. As they prepared to go down and explain the situation, Sarah realized that this incident, frightening as it was, had only strengthened her resolve. She was more certain than ever that her decision to start a new life in London was the right one. With each step forward, she was moving further away from the lies of her past and closer to a future built on truth and genuine love. The police officer stood in the living room, his presence bringing a sense of official gravity to the situation. Sarah and Nessa sat on the couch, both still shaken from the encounter with Jack. The officer's notebook was open, pen poised to take their statement. "So you say it was a relative who entered the house without permission?" the officer asked, his tone professional but kind. Sarah opened her mouth, ready to explain everything, about Henry, about Jack, about the years of deception, but something made her hesitate. She glanced at Nessa, seeing the concern in her mother's eyes, and made a split-second decision. It was just some strange homeless person," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He was hanging around the house, but he disappeared when he heard the sirens." She could feel Nessa's confusion radiating beside her, but her mother didn't interject. The officer looked between them, his brow furrowing slightly. "A homeless person," he repeated, his pen hovering over the notebook. "Are you sure? You seemed quite distressed on the phone." Sarah nodded, forcing a smile that she hoped looked convincing. "Yes, I'm sure. I think we just got a bit paranoid with everything that's been going on lately. But he's gone now and we're fine." The officer studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, I'm glad it was resolved without incident," he said, closing his notebook. "If anything else happens, don't hesitate to call us again. We're here to help." As the officer left, Sarah could feel the weight of Nessa's questioning gaze. Once the door closed behind him, Nessa turned to her daughter. "Sarah," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "why didn't you tell him the truth?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I didn't want to say it was my uncle," she explained, her voice low. "It would most likely not be positive for Henry, and I don't know yet what I should think of him. I just want to go home now. I don't want to give more statements to the police." Nessa's expression softened, understanding dawning in her eyes. She reached out, taking Sarah's hand in hers. "I understand," she said softly, "and I respect your decision, but are you sure this is what you want?" Sarah nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude for her mother's support. "I'm sure," she said. I think Henry really does have some disorders. That's not normal, sending his brother to look for me, trying to lure me back. But I can't bring myself to get him into more trouble right now. I need time to process all of this." Nessa pulled Sarah into a tight hug, and Sarah felt herself melting into the embrace. "If that's what you feel is right," Nessa murmured, "then that's what we'll do. I'm just so glad you're safe." As they broke apart, Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The events of the day had taken their toll, both physically and emotionally. "Can we go now?" she asked, her voice small. "I'm ready to leave this part of my life behind." Nessa nodded, standing up and gathering their belongings. "Of course, sweetheart, let's go home." As they walked out of the house, Sarah paused on the threshold, taking one last look at the place that had been her home for 18 years. It was strange how quickly it had transformed from a sanctuary to a reminder of lies and deception. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the journey ahead. In the Uber, as they drove away from her old life, Sarah felt a mix of emotions swirling within her. Relief at escaping the encounter with Jack, gratitude for Nessa's unwavering support, and a renewed determination to build a new life in London. As the familiar streets of her childhood faded behind them, Sarah realized that this trip had solidified something in her mind. She was ready to embrace her new identity fully, to become Sarah Wells not just in name but in spirit. The life of Ellie Gibson was truly behind her now, and while there were still challenges ahead, she felt stronger and more prepared to face them. The journey back to London passed in a blur of airport security checks, long flights, and brief layovers. Sarah spent much of the time lost in thought, processing the events of their whirlwind trip to Ohio. Beside her, Nessa remained a steady, comforting presence, offering silent support when needed and gentle conversation when the silence grew too heavy. As their plane touched down at Heathrow Airport, Sarah felt a curious mix of relief and apprehension wash over her. The familiar skyline of London, visible through the small airplane window, seemed to welcome her home. Yet the knowledge of what awaited her, the impending court hearings that would determine the fate of Lisa and Henry Gibson, weighed heavily on her mind. They made their way through customs and baggage claim, the process now familiar to Sarah after her recent travels. As they emerged into the arrivals area, Sarah was surprised to see Edric waiting for them, a warm smile on his face despite the clear worry in his eyes. "Welcome home," he said, enveloping both Sarah and Nessa in a tight hug. "How was the trip?" Sarah and Nessa exchanged a glance, silently agreeing to save the full story for later. "It was eventful," Nessa said diplomatically, "but we're glad to be back." As they made their way to the car, Edric filled them in on what they had missed. "The court date has been set," he explained, his voice low. "It's in a few hours, actually. I hope you're up for it, Sarah. If not, we can try to postpone." Sarah shook her head, a determined set to her jaw. "No, I'm ready," she said firmly. "I want this to be over with." The drive home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts about the upcoming hearing. As they pulled into the driveway of their house, Sarah felt a wave of fatigue wash over her. The events of the past few days, coupled with the jet lag, were catching up with her. "Why don't you rest for a bit before we head to the courthouse?" Nessa suggested, noticing Sarah's exhaustion. "We have a few hours." Sarah nodded gratefully, making her way up to her room. As she lay down on her bed, she found her mind racing despite her physical tiredness. What would happen at the hearing? How would she react to seeing Henry and Lisa again? And what would she say when asked to testify? Just as she was drifting off into a fitful sleep, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Sarah's heart skipped a beat when she saw the caller ID. It was Lisa, calling from the prison. For a moment, Sarah hesitated, her finger hovering over the answer button. Part of her wanted to ignore the call, to maintain the distance she had tried to establish. But another part, the part that still remembered the love and care she had received from Lisa over the years, made her press answer. "Hello?" Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah," Lisa's voice came through, sounding tired and strained. "I'm so glad you answered. I'm being transferred to the court soon for the hearing." Sarah remained silent, unsure of what to say. Lisa continued, her words coming out in a rush. "I just wanted to tell you, to do what your heart wants to. Whatever you decide to say in court, whatever you feel is right, I'll understand. I just want you to know that I'm sorry for everything, and that I'll respect your decision, even if you testify against me." Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. I appreciate that." There was a moment of silence, heavy with unspoken words and complicated emotions. Finally, Lisa spoke again, her voice soft. "Good luck, Sarah, and I love you no matter what happens." Before Sarah could respond, the line went dead. She sat there for a moment, the phone still pressed to her ear, feeling a confusing mix of emotions wash over her. Despite everything, a part of her still cared for Lisa, still remembered the years of love and care she had received. As she set the phone down, Sarah realized that she knew what she was going to do in court. It wouldn't be easy, and it might not make everyone happy, but she knew it was the right thing to do. With renewed determination, Sarah got up and began to prepare for the hearing. Whatever happened in that courtroom, she was ready to face it head-on, to speak her truth, and to take another step towards reclaiming her life and identity. The courthouse loomed before them, its imposing facade a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. Sarah stood between Nessa and Edric, drawing strength from their presence as they climbed the steps to the entrance. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on her, making each step feel like a monumental effort. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Sarah's eyes darted around the crowded hallway, half expecting to see Henry or Lisa, but they were nowhere in sight, likely already in the courtroom or a holding area. Their lawyer, a kind-faced woman named Margaret, met them outside the courtroom. "Are you ready, Sarah?" she asked gently, her eyes searching Sarah's face for any signs of hesitation. Sarah nodded, squaring her shoulders. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As they entered the courtroom, Sarah felt as though she were walking into another world. The polished wood, the somber atmosphere, the quiet murmur of voices. It all felt surreal, like a scene from a movie rather than her real life. They took their seats, and Sarah found herself studying the faces around her. There were police officers, court officials, and a handful of people she didn't recognize, perhaps reporters or curious onlookers drawn by the unusual nature of the case. The judge entered, and a hush fell over the room. He was an older man with a stern face, but there was a kindness in his eyes that Sarah found oddly comforting. "Given the circumstances of the kidnapping crime being a long time ago," the judge began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "the sentence will be lower than it might otherwise be. However, since there were fake documents and other crimes involved, we cannot simply disregard the severity of these actions." Sarah listened intently as the judge outlined the complexities of the case. He mentioned that Lisa's lesser involvement in creating the fake documents would be taken into consideration, but that her knowledge of the crime and failure to report it were still serious offenses. Then the moment Sarah had been both dreading and anticipating arrived. The judge turned his attention to her. "Miss Wells," he said, his tone gentler now, "given the unique circumstances of this case, your testimony about how the Gibsons treated you will play a significant role in determining their sentences. Would you like to make a statement?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling all eyes in the courtroom turn to her. She stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaky at first, but growing stronger as she continued, "I never doubted that I was loved. Henry and Lisa Gibson loved and cared for me like real parents, and I'll never forget their love." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "However, what they did is also unforgivable. They took me away from my real parents and stole my true life from me." Sarah turned slightly, her eyes finding Lisa at the defendant's table. "I believe that that Lisa should not be punished as harshly. While she was involved, she was always following her husband's lead. I don't think the idea to kidnap me came from her. In fact, in the end, she saved me from Henry's anger." The judge nodded, making notes as Sarah spoke. Then he asked about Henry, how he had treated her over the years. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "I never doubted that Henry actually loved me," she said slowly. "But I think I was more like a replacement for him, to fill an emptiness in his life. I still love him, and part of me wants to speak well of him too, but I think he's sick. He needs help." She recounted the incident at the Airbnb, how Henry had become violent and locked her in the bathroom. She also mentioned the encounter with his brother in Ohio, explaining how it had made her realize the extent of Henry's instability. As she finished speaking, Sarah felt drained but also relieved. She had spoken her truth, had given voice to the complicated tangle of emotions she felt towards the people who had raised her. The judge thanked her for her testimony, and Sarah returned to her seat. Nessa squeezed her hand reassuringly, and Sarah felt a rush of gratitude for her real parents' unwavering support. There was a brief recess as the judge conferred with his colleagues. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone waited for the final verdict. Sarah found herself holding her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, the judge returned. The courtroom fell silent as he prepared to deliver his verdict. "In light of Miss Wells' testimony, which has been given significant weight in this case," the judge began, his voice solemn, I have reached the following decision. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her entire body tense as she waited to hear the fate of the people who had raised her for 15 years. Lisa Gibson, the judge continued, you are sentenced to 6 years of probation for your involvement in the kidnapping and your knowledge of the fake documents. Given that you have no prior criminal record and considering Miss Wells's testimony, I believe this sentence is appropriate. Sarah saw Lisa's shoulders sag with relief, tears streaming down her face. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and Lisa gave a small, grateful nod. Henry Gibson, the judge said, his tone hardening slightly, as the key person in the kidnapping and the involvement of fake documents, and considering Miss Well's testimony regarding your recent behavior, you are sentenced to 8 years in prison. You will receive psychological support during your incarceration, and there will be a possibility of early release after 4 years if significant progress is made in addressing your mental health issues. Sarah watched Henry's reaction carefully. To her surprise, she saw something like relief flash across his face. Perhaps, she thought, he knew he needed help and was grateful to finally be getting it. As the judge's gavel fell, signaling the end of the hearing, Sarah felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Nothing could undo the years of deception and lost time with her real family. But it felt like justice had been served as best it could be under the circumstances. As they left the courtroom, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, hope, and a strange sense of closure. She knew that this was just the beginning of her journey to heal and rebuild her life, but for the first time since discovering the truth about her identity, she felt truly ready to face the future. The courthouse steps seemed less daunting as Sarah descended them, flanked by Nessa and Edric. The weight that had pressed down on her shoulders when they arrived had lifted, replaced by a curious mix of relief and uncertainty about the future. "We're so proud of you, Sarah," Nessa said softly, her arm wrapped protectively around her daughter's shoulders. "What you did in there, it took real courage." Edric nodded in agreement, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and concern. "You made the right decision," he added. "It couldn't have been easy, but you spoke from your heart." Sarah managed a small smile, grateful for their unwavering support. As they reached the bottom of the steps, she paused, turning to face her parents. "Can I ask you something?" she said hesitantly. "Of course, sweetheart," Nessa replied, her brow furrowing slightly at Sarah's serious tone. "What is it?" Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for their reaction. "Would you be okay if I stayed in contact with Lisa? She'll be released on probation, and I think I need to maintain some connection with her. And maybe after some time, I might want to get in contact with Henry again when he's made progress. After all, a part of me still loves them." She watched anxiously as Nessa and Edric exchanged a look, their expressions unreadable. For a moment, Sarah feared she had asked too much, that her desire to maintain a connection with the Gibsons would be seen as a betrayal of her real family. But then Nessa's face softened, and she reached out to take Sarah's hand. "Of course that's fine with us," she said gently. "We understand, Sarah. They were your family for 15 years. It's natural that you still care for them." Edric nodded in agreement. "We'll support you in whatever decisions you make," he added. "We're just grateful to have you in our lives now. We want you to be happy and at peace with your past." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, overwhelmed by their understanding and acceptance. She threw her arms around both of them, hugging them tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for understanding." As they broke apart, wiping away tears and sharing watery smiles, Edric cleared his throat. "What do you say we go out for dinner tonight?" he suggested, "to relax and share a family moment after all this turmoil." Sarah nodded eagerly, feeling a surge of warmth at the idea of a quiet family dinner. "That sounds perfect," she said, her smile genuine now. As they walked to the car, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead would not be easy. She knew there would be challenges as she navigated her new identity, built relationships with her real family, and found a way to honor her past while embracing her future. But for the first time since discovering the truth about her identity, she felt truly hopeful.